Jody's supposed
Phil was supposed to remind me to record. So now we're recording. Everything I've done since halfway through COVID is online on my YouTube channel. So we did Genesis and Romans and Acts up there, probably a couple of other things. You coming in? You want to come in? Nope. All righty. He's old enough to make up his own mind. So let's talk about number one. Let's go back to the Old Testament. I don't know how long this is going to take, but we'll see what we can do. And we'll start with the basics. And that is, I pulled these out. Let me get rid of this. You're going to see what I'm seeing when I do a Sunday school class. I just show my screen rather than do like a slide presentation, because it gets complicated and I'm not doing it formal. I'm just I have all the notes. Oh, who has notes and who doesn't? Sue is working on it. Oh, there they are. I think that Dana just volunteered to. All right, notes are being handed out. This is just for the Old Testament stuff we're going to do in the next couple of weeks. Hopefully, I don't drag it out any farther than that. But first up, the books of the Bible. Let's unlock a few things about the books of the Bible. Here they are. How many books of the Bible are there? How many books of the Old Testament are there? What's that? There's 39. How many of the books are narrative? Are storytelling? What's the difference between 1 Samuel and Haggai or Micah or Isaiah or Psalms? And the answer is storytelling. Overwhelmingly, there's certain books of the Old Testament that are almost nothing but storytelling. The narrative, what we might call the narrative of redemption. The history of redemption in storytelling form. And so much of the Bible, what you're looking at is the history of God's dealings with his people. And most of the time, in fact, maybe even overwhelmingly, it is not pretty or neat or nice or clean. And sometimes it's downright brutal. So about half of the text of the Old Testament is storytelling, is books that are almost exclusively storytelling. And those are those books. Those are all almost exclusively storytelling. And what you'll notice is all but Daniel are front-loaded. They're the first 16 books minus Leviticus, 16 books of the Old Testament. So it's always been my opinion that narrative in the church kind of gets shunted aside in favor of books like Romans or Galatians or Ephesians or something like that, or Psalms. But man, if you want to know who God is, you have to look at what he did, because that's how he communicated it. There is not a single theological book in the Old Testament. There are, from my vantage point, this is my construction here, the books of Moses, 4 out of 5 of which are narrative. The story of creation in Genesis 1 and 2 is narrative. The story of the fall is narrative, what happened. The story of Abraham's and the covenant promise is all narrative. The Exodus, all of it is narrative. And so we have the books of Moses. We have what I'm going to call the historical books. And we'll talk about why that's an issue in a second. And there they are. And that covers, let's call it 1400 to 586. So 800 years of Israelite history is covered between Joshua and, well, if you're going to go to Esther, over 800 years to Esther, which would be the exile. You'll know what all these things are by the time we finish. Almost 900 years maybe over 900 years of Israelite history. So if you think it's not important to read those stories, they're in there for a reason. We'll talk about why in a second. And then you can add Daniel to that as well. Daniel is narrative as well. So you have the prophets, and then you have, I'm just going to call it the Psalms, but really it's the Psalms, the wisdom literature. I don't want to use the word other because no book of the Bible belongs in an other category. But in our Sunday school class, I've spent the last, since 2012. No, all of it, almost all of it since 2006, doing narrative books from Genesis all the way through to Acts. So we've done all the narrative books except a couple of Gospels, Matthew and John. I'm not going to do John because everybody else is. So I'm probably not going to do it. But then all the narrative books and almost all the narrative books in the Old Testament as well. And now we've started over and we did Genesis. We just finished it 2 weeks ago. And we're going to move on to Exodus probably in the fall. So I really love biblical narrative. And there's a reason for that. Let's go look at some slides here. There's what we were just looking at. That's too small. That's why I did what I did. Here's the reason. It's the connection between narrative, storytelling, connected storytelling, chained storytelling, and theology. We don't have prophets or wise men who were gifted theology and wrote it down. Or do we? We'll get back to that when we get to the New Testament. But in the Old Testament, we don't have that. What we have is people watching what's happened, chronicling it, and inspired writers now capturing it in a tradition. That's what we have. So that's the connection between narrative and theology. And a friend of mine in Washington named Greg, who some of the people in here got a little exposure to him during the COVID. He just finished his master's at I forget where he finished, but anyway, he coined this phrase. I think it was him, narrative theology. How do we get our theology? And the answer is out of the storytelling. The stories contained in the history of the redemption are the raw material that shapes theology, the study of God, our knowledge of God, anthropology, our knowledge of ourselves, our worship, and our practices. It comes from storytelling. But there's very few orders. Thou shalt do this outside of what God told the Israelites to do. We just don't get a lot of that. It comes out of modeling. You see it in storytelling, and so you put it into practice in some fashion. That's how the people of God have functioned. And I'll give you an example of that. We have this statement as a heading over. You all are getting tired of hearing this because I talk about it so much, but I was in Genesis, so why not? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And this is how he did it. And we get the storytelling. He did this. He said that. He said this. This happened. That happened. On and on and on. And out of that storytelling, then, in the traditions of the writings, we have a psalm. All the gods of the people, thousands of years later, well, 1,000 years later, or some number of years, some hundreds of years later, all the gods of the peoples are idols, but the Lord made the heavens. And so he infers from, this inspired writer infers from his knowledge of these acts of God that there is a single categorical difference between the God of Abraham, the one that he worships, and these idols that the nations worship. And that difference is his position as creator. So it's not just that he's greater than the idols of the nations. He's incomparably great. He's in a category by himself. That is inferred from Genesis chapter 1. And that becomes theology. Or another example, Isaiah chapter 45. Isaiah would have been written, we'll talk about this in a minute, in let's call it the 700s. So 700 or more years after the Exodus, 1,300 years after Abraham. I am the Lord, Yahweh, the God of Abraham, and there is no other. Besides me, there is no God. I will gird you, though you have not known me, that men may know from the rising to the setting of the sun, from the time they wake up to the time they go to bed, that there is no one besides me. I am the Lord, and there is no other. Why? I am the one forming light and creating darkness, causing well-being and creating calamity. I am the Lord who does all these things. I am the creator. I am the unique one. And so there you can see how narrative, storytelling, gets embedded in the mind as theology. I was going to say something else. I'm talking a lot, so if anybody wants to interrupt, welcome to do so. Let's see. We'll talk about tradition in a minute. So that's the connection. In the New Testament, it's a little different story. Half the Old Testament is narrative. About 60% of the New Testament is narrative. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts. And then out of the events, and for the first time, additionally, through supernatural revelation, let me check and see if somebody's trying to get me a feed or something. Through supernatural revelation, theology is born, in my view, directly. And I'll give you an example of that. No place in the Gospels do you see a clear theology of atonement attached to the cross. The closest you're going to get is the Son of Man did not come to serve, but to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. You get this generic statement like that. The Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. But you don't see that direct, detailed connection between, you certainly don't see anything like justification by faith. So it's my belief, and I've said this before, that that our knowledge of the righteousness of God being imputed, very Luther way of saying it, Martin Luther, we'll talk about him much later. Our knowledge of that, justification by faith, the atoning death of Jesus on the cross, came by supernatural revelation to the people who wrote it down and imparted it to us. And had they not done that, no one on the face of the planet would have inferred that theological knowledge from the Gospels. And they were there. Peter, John, Matthew, Mark, they were all there. But apart from supernatural revelation, that knowledge was not something that human beings were going to infer themselves. And so we were gifted these writings, a written record of what God communicated, in my view, to these inspired writers. That we're going to get into a level now of inspiration in that regard. We'll talk about that later too. So that's the nature of theology and narrative. I love biblical narrative. I turn it on all the time. I listen to it at work. I listen to it at home. Narrative. It's a little harder to memorize, but yeah. All right. So back to your notes. Let's talk about, let's see. Let's see. Let's look at it.
Gary,
Yeah.
who gave all the laws to Moses? And like the blood sacrifices, doesn't that all tie back into that? Is that a redemption?
Yes. All comes from narrative. How did Moses obtain the law? Moses is the lawgiver, small l. But of course, there was a capital L lawgiver. How did Moses obtain the mandates that were supposed to be binding on his people, but which they never fully incorporated? How did he obtain those? Supernatural supernatural, depends on what you mean by revelation, right? If you mean dreams, no. If you mean stood up on a mountain in a thick cloud and spoke directly with the lawgiver, yes. So there would be no doubt about the authority of there's a lot of reasons God would do it that way. When you think of that scene, what book is this in? What book is the scene of God giving the law to Moses? It's in the book of Exodus, in the 20s. Exodus 20s and 30s of Exodus. But think about the scene. He's got however many hundreds of thousands of people in a valley, in a plain, by a mountain, a small mountain, and there's a thick cloud and thunder and lightning and so forth. And Moses marches himself with Joshua. Joshua stops halfway up, I think, or something. Moses continues on by himself. He disappears in the cloud. He's there for 40 days. And while he's there, he's getting instructions from God. And as part of that instructions, he gets so important are these 10 commandments that they get engraved on stone tablets, which he's going to promptly come down and break. Because no sooner does he go up into the mountain while they're witnessing all of that, than the people get sick of it and decide they want to go back to Egypt because there's cucumbers there or something like that. So they get Aaron, Moses' brother, to make a golden calf out of the jewelry, out of the gold that God gifted to them by them being able to plunder the Egyptians, so that gold could be used to make a tabernacle. And instead of making a tabernacle with it, they preferred to make a golden calf that they could worship and call. What did they call that golden calf? Huh? More specifically, Yahweh. It's worse than you think. Oh, yeah. And who said, "This is the God that brought you out of the land of Egypt," pointing at the calf? Who said that? Aaron, the great high priest, the brother of Moses, while Moses was up on the mountain. The scene is shocking. It's the worst moment. Other than the cross itself, talk about snatching victory from the jaws of defeat. The cross, the greatest example of that, what I call the great reversal. God defeated death by dying on the cross and rising again. That's how he defeated death. I call that the great reversal. But other than that, that scene at the mountain is the worst moment in the history of Israel, which is why, when we look at this in a second, that's my caption over the Old Testament. Right there. The rise and fall of Israel.
Where's the peak? You have a rise.
Where's the peak?
Yeah.
Where's Israel's best moment?
David, probably.
Where's Israel's, not David's best moment? Dave went up. Let's do both. Okay, let's go with two. Pastor has a point. Let's get the first one. Israel's best. What is Israel's greatest generation? What is the only generation that gets an accolade from the writer? All that generation served the Lord.
The generation that entered into the promised land.
The conquest
So
generation.
this is the second generation, if you will, because the first generation died in the wilderness.
The conquest generation. Right off the bat. That's and then it's all downhill. That's okay. It's all that, right? They get there, it's this great start, man. We're really cooking. We're hitting on all cylinders. Everything's going great.
Back to the golden calf for a minute. That was a direct violation of the second commandment. Just days after God spoke it in their presence.
Yeah. So that happened. He spoke it in chapter 20. And about 40 days later, Was there 2 trips up the mountain at that point?
There was 2 different 40 trips, but Moses was on the first trip when it happened.
Yeah, that's right. He brings the tablets down. Yeah, okay, right. What?
They heard the 10 commandments. He spoke the 10 commandments to the whole congregation in their presence on the holy mountain. But then after that, Moses went up on the mountain and received the rest of the law.
So they,
So
go ahead.
that would be, Exodus chapters 21 through 32, plus somewhere on one of those trips, the book of Leviticus, probably.
So the 20 is the commandments, all narrative, storytelling. 21 through about 24 is what he's talking about, is often called the covenant code. Further elaboration on the 10 commandments. Goes back up on the mountain to get specific instructions. Well, now that we're onto it, right? Didn't take me long to get sidetracked. To get specific instructions particularly about the tabernacle. And so it's a buildup, and you have to imagine the scene 25 or so to 32, where he's receiving these instructions specifically towards the end of that on Aaron and his priestly garments and what the Levitical priests are supposed to do. And you have to imagine from the God's eye point of view, there's Moses on the mountain and God speaking to him. Of course, he's not, I'm being, what do you call that? Anthropomorphic. I'm from a human point of view. Imagine you're up there with the God's eye perspective, speaking to Moses about Aaron's priestly garments and the sanctification of Aaron, setting him apart for the priestly service and the tabernacle, very detailed instructions of the tabernacle. And while he's doing all that, from his perspective, right there, Moses is on the mountain, he's talking, but right there, down below, right there, the people are worshiping a golden calf and sitting down to eat and rising up to play. And they're ready to head back to Egypt. While he's doing this, so he stops and says, okay, get yourself back down there. This is parental, because your people, whom you brought out of Egypt, have defiled themselves, and so on and so forth. So it's the little things, right? It's a shocking scene, but it's all storytelling, and it's gripping. I mean, it's just great storytelling. Just read it over and over, and you get these little more and more comes out of it. But okay, did anybody else want to sidetrack me more at this point?
All right.
I'm an easy target. Okay, let's drop down to how this happens. Things start probably almost exclusively almost every time as oral tradition. Abraham's family, they valued their past in ways that we don't understand. We're post-enlightenment. We can talk about that sometime. What we care about is the present. There's an inherent, what do you want to call it? Disinterest, almost sometimes dismissiveness about the past. Very few people, this kind of got resurrected a little bit through, these websites that can tell you your family history. So it's kind of received a little bit of a rebirth. You can, whatever those, one of them got in a lot of trouble with, what is the name of one of them? Yeah, Ancestry.com and so forth. You can give them your DNA and they can track your family history and so forth. But so it's kind of received a little bit of rebirth. But as modern people, we don't care about the past generally. I don't know who my great grandparents were, or everything before my grandparents is black to me. I don't know anything about it, or sideways at that level. It's just not of interest to me. I have no idea. My name is McMahon, which ironically I think means son of man. I'm not going to go around and say that, but I think it's Scottish. And the Mick part is son of, and then the family name is Mahan or whatever it is, I think. But the point is, I don't know if I'm how much Irish I have in me or anything else. I just know I have a name that seems to be Scottish. She might know more about this than I do.
Mick should be Irish, but the Mac Scottish.
But anyway, they were not like that. They preserved. They wanted to live on through their posterity. And that wasn't just the Israelites, that was the surrounding peoples too, which is why pharaohs built pyramids for their own debt, for their bodies, for their corpses when they died, because they didn't think it stopped there. And so those were they weren't tombs of the dead. They were the next phase to these people. So they lived on in their minds through their posterity, which is why a man like Abraham, who was told straight up that he would not inherit the land, some generation into the future would inherit the land. And he was distraught because he didn't have a son to accomplish that, who would eventually become Isaac. That's how much it was fine with him if he didn't get the land, because he lived on in his mind. What mattered was he lived on in his posterity. Same with Isaac, same with Jacob, and so on and so forth. These people remembered. And so as part of that, they had these oral traditions that they would pass down as in families, and for institutions, you would have had Levitical traditions, but they're oral chronicles that eventually get written down. And then in my view, probably at some point you end up with an inspired writer who composes, orders, selects what's going to be in there. 1st and 2nd Samuel, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and so on and so forth, which is what makes Judges such a remarkable book, because it's from the beginning to the end, except for the mention of the conquest generation, utterly, what's the word? Yes, about its own history. It's a chronicle of the evils of Israel during the worst period in the history of Israel. No, that's not true either, because it's going to get worse than them. In a very bad period in the history of Israel. Israel almost went out. They very nearly got assimilated during the period by the end of the period of the Judges. And then God intervened through a man named Samuel, and snatched victory from the jaws of defeat. Samuel would eventually lead to David, and finally, 400 years after the Exodus, we have a nation born, the kingdom of Israel under David. But man, up until then, but by the grace of God, that nation was going to get assimilated into Canaanite practice, Canaanite religion, all of it. They were gone. But he wasn't going to let that happen, because he made a promise to Abraham 400, 500, 600 years earlier. So we have chronicles of that, and they end up getting written down. Did somebody memorize the genealogies, the numbers in the book of Numbers? It's 8 chapters of it, I think, as I remember. 8 chapters in Numbers. Well, I mean, they could have received those numbers by supernatural revelation. Or go for the simpler answer. They're right over there written down because it mattered to these people. Or 1 Chronicles, read the first 11 chapters. The same thing. Is it 11 chapters? First half of the book or so? I don't remember, but it's tough going. And the reason it's tough going is because we don't care. We would never do that. Well, they did it all incessantly. They did it so much that it annoys us and we skip over it. But it's in the Word of God. So you just got to figure out what you're going to do with it. The genealogies in the early chapters of Genesis. I mean, even Esau. What do I care about the genealogy of Esau? What do I care about the 12 dukes who came from Esau? You know,
They care about them because, they took over Israel where Israel's supposed to be. So from that sense, we do care about
eat them.
Well,
Not in the Bible.
Never mind.
They don't care about the things we care about, and we don't care about the things they care about, and we don't realize either one of those things. So we skip over the things we don't care about. We don't even realize we do it.
I would dare say that in the Eastern mindset, ancestry is a lot more important than it is in the Western mindset, and we are in the Western mindset.
We are products. This will be worth an hour at some point, probably. We are products of, we are post-enlightenment We are a product of modernity. Onward and upward, progress, leave the past behind and build a better future. Although, frankly, the better future is not going all that well and hasn't for 100 and, well, since the Guns of August in 1911, I guess would be a good starting point. What happened in 1911?
World War One.
Yeah. Thank you, modernity. That was great. Anyway, there's another sidetrack, 9:52. Okay. So we no longer have the original manuscripts of these written records. But what we had was oral tradition. So that's the bottom of the first page. I'm out of order here, but that's where I am. We have family, institutional, and national experience captured in oral traditions. Stories they tell themselves and share, which then become sacred in their minds. And then sacred, that however this happens, that sacred oral tradition is collected and becomes inspired written tradition. Why do we believe it's inspired? Because we believe it's inspired. I'm not going to give you an argument for why I think the book of Judges is inspired. What's the difference between an inspired book of Judges and an uninspired book of Judges? I'm not sure. Because the inspired book of Judges is so consistently hostile, or not hostile, negative on the a negative portrayal of the story of Israel. You know, it's just if they're embellishing the wrong way. So you're often, when you look at these authors writing about their own people, you're seeing their own people captured through the eyes of a monotheist, a person who believes in the one God and worships the one God as he looks at a polytheistic, depraved people, his own people. And that's often the lens that you're going to see them look through their own people. That's all of the book of Judges, all these kings. There's not a single king in the history of the northern kingdom of Israel, we'll get to that, which goes on for 150 years, 931 to 722, do the math, 200 and some odd years. There's not a single king in the history of Israel who was called good. The refrain is, and he did evil in the sight of the Lord, like Jeroboam, the one who started it all at the beginning of the divided kingdom, who was the paradigm of evil. That's the refrain over and over and 20, I think it's 20 or 21 times. He did evil. There's 6 good kings in the kingdom of Judah, but you can count them on almost one hand. Everybody else is evil. And that's there. They report this. Inspired tradition reporting on its own sins and its own evils. That's part of what makes it so compelling. But anyway, you end up then with inspired written tradition, but now that written tradition has to make its way through time and somehow survive the sands of time in this case. And so this copying has to happen. There's no printing press. When is the printing press going to be invented?
Just about now in the Reformation, wasn't it?
1542 or something like that.
Close. Back about 50 years or so. Late 1400s. That's the first time you can get print. So the question is going to become, how on earth did we manage to have an Old Testament that survived? The stories are 2100 BC. Printing press is 1400 AD. Sounds to me like 3,500 years. And how reliable is it? Well, New Testament, first century, first century, look at me stumble around and make things up as you go along. Where's the books of the New Testament? Well, we're not going to look at that because I can't find it right now. Well, anyway, first century AD, How did it get to 1400 AD, 1300 years or more intact? That's the miracle. That's the providence of God. So that's what we're going to talk about. Okay. If you read let's talk a little more about how this written tradition becomes embedded as scripture. If you read these books, and you got to read the tough ones, First and Second Kings and so forth, you will see this reference to Chronicles. I'm not talking about the book of Chronicles. I'm talking about the Chronicles of somebody. So you have, for example, the Chronicles of David in First Chronicles 27:24. And then you have the Chronicles of Samuel in chapter 29, verse 29. And then also in that same chapter, the Chronicles of Nathan and the Chronicles of Gad. Well, we don't know anything about these chronicles, except that they appear to have been source material that is used, that the author used to compile First Chronicles. So don't necessarily think of it as just some guy sitting down and starting at the top and writing. He's got source material to work with. Exactly the same thing will happen for the New Testament. Luke chapter 1. Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile an account of the things accomplished among us, so also I, having investigated everything carefully, am going to write it down for you in consecutive order. Well, what is investigating everything carefully? He's not referring to supernatural revelation. He's referring to talking to people and looking at source material, like the Gospel of Mark, and compiling his own record. That's what he did. And so here they are. Here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 7. The Chronicles of the Kings of Media and Persia. So part of the source material for First Kings is a record kept by the Persians and the Medes, or the Medes and the Persians as they're called, of their kings. And they had access to that, and they used that to compile their chronicle as well. So why do
Gary?
Yeah.
I was just thinking, if they hadn't been so involved, concerned, whatever you want to call it, for all these, the generational record, we wouldn't have had a record that we could confront evolution with. And Israel wouldn't still be Israel, because they wouldn't be able to prove their genealogical history. You know, and even my grandparents on my dad's side, they were both German, completely German, even though they, were now in the States. And they were so upset with my dad when he did not pick out a woman that was only German. And I think maybe it's more of even an Eastern type mindset even today. But I think it's interesting that God had all that written down so we could look back and say, okay, we can count these generations and we can see about when man started versus what evolution says. And we can also now they can search their genealogies over there in Israel. And when people come in, they can say, yes, you were of the tribe, because they need to know who are is it the Levites, I think, or Kohens? I can't remember. Anyway, one of those two is very important right now to Israel. And so I think God had him write it all down and to have that mindset for his own purposes. Just my thought.
Yeah. As far as evolution goes, evolution's big problem is not the Bible. It's its own science. I mean, it is, the Bible is a problem, but evolution is coming up against.
We have used the Bible to say it's a younger Earth. Like when we had the Scopes trial, that was used as one of our arguments. And we wouldn't have had that to argue with if we didn't have it written down. And I agree with you that the science itself just doesn't make sense. The other day, somebody was just posting and saying that, oh, nature decided about the umbilical cord that we couldn't use the mouth opening. We had to have another opening. And nature decided that we had to have the placenta and all. And I'm thinking, isn't that just stupid? Because nature doesn't have a mind to decide things with. So yeah, I agree with you. There's truly science. But it's interesting that Scopes that trial did use that to say, no, we haven't been here a million years. Anyway, go ahead. Sorry.
So the original manuscripts are lost in all cases.
Saying I couldn't hear.
She was talking about evolution and basically evolution in the Bible. You couldn't hear her?
No.
What is it? Not going through the speaker.
Yeah, we'll have to figure out a way to put
All right.
get a sound system set up next week and get that.
All right. Anyway, the original manuscripts are gone. And more importantly, we don't need them. Because we have a God who guaranteed that we would receive, and we'll talk about how we can be so, that's a part of the point of this, how we can be so sure that we have what was original. How confident can we be that we have now what was written by Moses 30 or 20, how do the math, 3,500 years ago. How can we be so confident? How can we know that what Luke wrote in Luke and Acts, or Paul wrote in Romans, is in front of us right now? That's the point. And that's where we're going to go with this. But the original manuscripts are lost. Oral tradition becomes written tradition. It's all viewed as sacred. Written tradition becomes written tradition at a certain point is inspired and locked in and accepted and accepted by the nation, by the people. That's interesting too. So this book, for example, this book of Judges, when was the book of Judges written? That's a great question. So we're going to go ahead and talk about that now, so we'll get to that now so we can think about this issue. This book is unceasingly negative and insulting to the Israelites. Yet, for some reason, they held it to be sacred. How does that happen? Everything after 1 Kings chapter 11 is unceasingly negative in the history of, in narrative, is unceasingly negative. And that's not true. Almost unceasingly negative about Israel. These little dots like Josiah, but it doesn't last long. Why would it be accepted as sacred tradition? By the time of Jesus, the rabbinical schools, they all believed these books are inspired, sacred tradition. Well, that's not true either. The Pharisees did. Let's just go with them. The Pharisees did. Jesus school. Jesus would have been considered Pharisaical because he believed in the resurrection of the dead, which is why you see so much conversation with he was not a Pharisee, but he was like-minded in his beliefs about resurrection. So you see this dialogue between him and Pharisees. And the same thing is going to happen in the book of Acts, where you will see Pharisees now joining the church. So it's very natural for a Pharisee to become a Christian because Pharisees already believe in the resurrection of the dead. But why would these people be so attached to a tradition that is so insulting and negative about them? But yet there it is. And so, you gonna say something? Let's see. Let's think about that. You have up here every event on here, from the first one to the last one, is chronicled in narrative. Is a part of the storytelling of the Bible. So if any of these events, and they're also critical, every one of these events is a critical turning point in the history of Israel and in the history of redemption. So if any of these are sort of blurry to you, there's a great place to start. I've given you a look here at where you can find them. This is a record. The yellow is when the events happen. So Genesis covers events from well, let's just start with Abraham. It goes back farther. But in terms of the history of Israel, since this is a schema of Israel, from Abraham here through Jacob's family going to Egypt, somewhere you're around here, late 1800s BC. We're in AD right now. Exodus, get a bit of a break, and then it pops in again, and that's going to go on till about 1400 BC. So those are the events of the Exodus, the events of the Judges. Here's the conquest. That's Joshua. 1st and 2nd Samuel, the rise of Samuel, then Saul, then David. That's 1st and 2nd Samuel. And then the Chronicles, the Kings and Chronicles. And that will extend for a long time until the first exile under the who exiled Israel? Who conquered? Assyria conquered is what city? What's the capital of the Assyrian Empire? So that's the first exile. That's the northern kingdom of Israel. You'll know what that is by the time we finish. Now you have the southern kingdom of Judah. About 140 years later, it too is invaded and conquered by Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar was the king. Here's that extra credit. Who was the king of the Assyrian Empire at the time? I'm not sure I remember. Sennacherib. There was two of them, Tiglath-Pileser. There was two invasions. One didn't succeed and the next one did. But that's all Chronicles. The 2nd Kings and 2nd Chronicles, I think. Yeah, 2nd Kings and 2nd Chronicles. So now you have the second exile. And that's the purpose of 1st and 2nd Kings, to chronicle from 1st Kings, it's going to start with Solomon and his reign, but then his fall, and then all the way through 1st and 2nd Kings to the deportations of the exiles, and then exactly the same thing for 2nd Chronicles. And so that's how important this stuff is. Whole book's dedicated to the evils of Israel. And you read 2nd Kings, and he did evil, and he did evil. Chronicles, he did evil. 2nd Chronicles, he did evil. The whole book was written to tell you about the evil of the kings during this period. And you go, why would somebody write that or chronicle that or accept the chronicles and compile them and then have the nation? And then why would the nation embrace it to the point where it becomes sacred tradition? But they did, all the way down through to the time of Jesus. And then the return from exile under the Persians, about 539, 538, Cyrus, king of Persia. You're going to see Nehemiah, Ezra, and so forth. So anyway, we're going to be a lot more detailed about the New Testament because we can. And I can talk about that. As far as this is when the events happened. Genesis covers this time period. Exodus covers this time period. All these narratives books cover a time period. They're not necessarily chronological, but they have a beginning and an end that corresponds to a certain time, date, even if we don't know the date. But the written part, remember, these people believed in oral tradition. So they would go a long time passing things down orally until anyone bothered to write it down. And I'll give you a great example of that outside of the Bible, and that is the Iliad, the great Greek epic by Homer. It is believed that poem, that epic, whatever you want to call it, was passed down orally for hundreds of years. before it was finally written down. But there are no scholars who study that work. They're Homerists. That sounds terrible. People who study Homer are lost in agnosticism and doubt about whether we really have what Homer wrote. And the reason is that work was regarded as sacred. And when you think something is sacred, you're careful with it. You don't give yourself freedom to just make stuff up and change stuff. That's the nature of sacred. If we lost the Bible and we sat down and we got to recompile this somehow out of people's memory, I dare say everyone in this room, we would have arguments, and the arguments would be about what did he really say? Not, I wanted to say this or that. And when you find somebody that wants to do that, that's probably the guy you're going to kick out of the room. You want what was actually, what the tradition actually was. And so that was their concern. And so with the tradition of the Old Testament, you have the books of Moses, in my view, written sometime during the period after the Exodus and before the conquest. What are the books of Moses? In that order: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. First 5 books of the Old Testament, rightly so. So we're going to go with that one. Then you have the book of Joshua. When was the book of Joshua written? Anybody want to go out on a limb? I don't. Judges?
I would say Judges was written during the time of Samuel.
On we go. So here's my view, and I think it's probably a majority view, that these compilations into what we have were probably, when he talks about and all the acts of so-and-so and what he did, Solomon. I think actually there's a book called he references the Acts of Solomon or something like that. In his wisdom and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah? That book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah would be a growing body. From the vantage point of a guy who's after Solomon. We just don't know how far after. And so the next king comes up, Rehoboam, and all that he did, and his this and that, and how he waged war. Are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah? Good and bad. And it gets added. And then his son reigns in his stead. And so the next king comes along, and he gets added. And then at some point, we have, out of that material, 1st and 2nd Kings, which would probably be a new chronicle, since he's referencing the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah as a separate thing, out of which, plus other material, he's going to shape his work. But when that happened, we don't know. We do know with Judges, for example, the last, what is the last statement in the book of Judges?
Everyone,
The whole thing matters.
at that time, there was no king.
At that time, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. It's repeated twice in the last 5 chapters of the book. And in between those 2 times, in the middle of it, as like a bracketing reminder, now in those days, there was no king in Israel. Well, all of those statements imply that at the point of writing, there was a king in Israel. So if the book of if the period of time covered in the Judges is, 1390 something till 1010, when the last judge passes off the scene, I'm sorry, 1050, when Saul becomes king or something like that. If that's when that happened, and he's talking about now there in those days there was no king in Israel, you're into a later time when there was a king in Israel, and not only a king in Israel, but probably a good king. Because from the vantage point of the writer, he's saying the reason they're being like this, and everyone's doing what was right in their own eyes, and the worship was uncontrolled, and there was idolatry, and this stuff was happening all over the tribes and everything is precisely because it wasn't centralized in Jerusalem, controlled by the Levitical priests. There was no uniform national worship in Jerusalem. So you can think of it as he's now writing from a vantage point of where that's working. So David, the latter reign of David, the early reign of Solomon, maybe Solomon commissioned, right? Who knows? We don't have any idea. But you can see how then hundreds of years might pass between the first events of Judges and when it finally is codified as inspired scripture as the book of Judges. But itself, it too might have been a chronicle. And so that's the nature of the way our books that we read are often compilations of works that are anonymous to us, and we don't have any idea about them, what's other than the names of them. But we've been gifted this writing. And so we'll pick up right there. We don't have a lot more to say about, we're going to talk about, we'll continue on with talking about the manuscript tradition, specifically the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Septuagint, and what's called the Masoretic text, which is the Hebrew text of the Old Testament that is translated into your English Old Testament and what happened there. So we'll do that the next time.
Here. Put that up for-
Yeah, I'm going to print all these out in color. They were kind of still a work in progress this morning. They weren't quite settled, but I'll go ahead and print them out and give you copies of them.
Vic and Gary, if I can talk to you. Vic, I need you in here.